Right now, sitting inside your computer, there's a tiny chip that knows more about you than your closest friend. It knows every file you have ever saved, every document you have deleted and thought was gone forever, every photo, every message, every search, every login. It remembers the things you tried to erase. It has been quietly keeping records since the first moment you turned your machine on, and almost nobody knows it is doing this. That chip is your SSD, your solid-state drive. And what it is, login G in the background of your digital life, is something the storage industry has never been particularly eager to advertise. But by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what your SSD is recording, why it is doing it, who can access that data, and precisely what you need to do to take back control. Stay with me, because there is a revelation coming in the final section of this video about what forensic investigators and data recovery specialists can extract from a supposedly wiped SSD that will completely change the way you think about digital privacy. Most people who learn this for the first time cannot believe it is real. It is real, and you need to know about it. Let us start with the basics, because to understand why your SSD is logging your activity, you first need to understand what an SSD actually is and how it differs fundamentally from the spinning hard drives that came before it. For most of computing history, computers stored data on mechanical hard disk drives. These are devices with physical spinning platters, coated in magnetic material and tiny REA. D-write heads that float just nanometers above the surface of those platters, magnetizing and demagnetizing tiny spots to store ones and zeros. They are remarkable pieces of engineering, but they are also mechanicus. L devices. They have moving parts, they wear out, they make noise, and they are relatively slow because the physical head has to move to the right location on the spinning platter before it can read or write data. Solid-state drives changed all of this. Instead of spinning platters and moving heads, an SSD stores data in flash memory cells. Billions of tiny transistors that trap electrons to represent ones and zeros. No moving parts. Dramatically faster read and write speeds. Much more resilient to physical shock. Quieter. In most configurations, more energy efficient. The advantages were so compelling that within about a decade of their mainstream introduction, SSDs became the dominant storage technology in laptops, and they are now increasingly common in desktop computers and even enterprise servers. But here is what the marketing materials for SSDs never emphasize. The architecture that makes SSDs so fast and so reliable also requires a level of internal management complexity that creates a rich trail of log data. And that data tells a remarkably detailed story about everything you have ever done with your computer. To understand why, you need to understand a fundamental limitation of flash memory. Unlike a magnetic hard drive, where you can overwrite data simply by writing new magnetic values over old ones, flash memory cells cannot be overwritten directly. Before new data can be written to a flash memory cell, the existing data must first be erased. And erasing flash memory happens not at the level of individual cells, but at the level of larger blocks, typically containing hundreds of pages of data. This physical reality creates an enormous engineering challenge. How do you manage a storage device efficiently when the fundamental write operation requires erasing large blocks before anything can be written? The answer is a sophisticated piece of software and hardware. Built directly into your SSD called the flash translation layer, combined with a controller chip that manages all the complex operations happening inside the drive. This combination handles a set of functions that are absolutely essential for making SSDs practical, and each of those functions generates internal logging data. The first function is wear leveling. Flash memory cells can only be erased and rewritten a limited number of times, typically somewhere between a few thousand and a few 100,000 cycles depending on the type of flash memory, before they begin to fail. If a naive storage system always wrote new data to the same physical locations, those cells would wear out quickly while hers sat barely used. Wear leveling is the process by which the SSD controller distributes writes across all the available flash cells as evenly as possible, dramatically extending the drive's lifespan. To do this effectively, the controller maintains detailed internal logs that track how many write cycles each block has experienced, which blocks are wearing out, and how the logical addresses that the operating system uses map to the physical locations on the drive where the data is actually stored. The second function is garbage collection. Remember that flash memory has to be erased at the block level before new data can be written. When you delete a file, the operating system marks the logical space as available, but the SSD controller still has the old data sitting in physical flash cells. Before that space can be used or new writes, those cells have to be erased. Garbage collection is the background process that consolidates valid data, erases blocks that are no longer needed, and maintains a pool of clean, ready-to-write blocks. This process runs continuously in the background, even when your computer is idle, and it generates extensive internal logging data tracking. which blocks have been processed, when they were processed, and what their state is. The third function is the write buffer and cache management. To maintain performance, SSDs use internal caches, small amounts of faster memory that act as a buffer between the F8 operations your operating system expects and the slightly slower reality of flash memory management. Data writ. 10 to the drive passes through this cache, and the controller logs the flow of data through the buffer to manage integrity and ensure that cached data is not lost if power is suddenly cut. There is a free tool that Microsoft does not want you to know exists, not because the tool is illegal, not because using it violates any terms of service that you agreed to when you set up your Windows machine, not because it does anything that a reasonable person would characterize as wrong or harmful or aggressive toward the operating system IT runs on. Microsoft does not want you to know it exists because it works. Because it does precisely what its developers built it to do. Because it closes the data collection pathways, disables the tracking infrastructure, neutralizes the file monitoring systems, and shuts down the behavioral surveillance architecture that Windows 11 has been running on your machine in ways you were never clearly told about and almost certainly never consented to in any meaningful sense of that word. The tool is called O&O Shutup 10++. It is free. It is maintained by a reputable German software development company called O&O Software that has been building Windows utility software for over 20 years. It requires no installation. It runs directly from a downloaded executable file that you can delete after using it. It does not itself collect any data about your machine or your usage. It does not require a Microsoft account or any account of any kind. It does not need internet access to do its job. It is a single file that you download, run, and use to take back control of what your Windows machine does with your data, your files, your behavioral patterns, and your computing life. The reason you likely haven't heard about it from any official Microsoft source, from any Windows setup screen, and from any privacy settings menu that Microsoft has built into Windows 11 is the same reason that the nightly data transmissions, the HIDDN AI monitor, the telemetry rollback mechanism, and the file synchronization pipeline moving your documents to Microsoft servers were all discovered by independent researchers rather than disclosed by Microsoft directly. Microsoft's commercial model depends on the data collection infrastructure that this tool disables. Tools that effectively disable that infrastructure are not something Microsoft promotes. They are something Microsoft's entire product communication strategy is designed to ensure most users never discover. Most Windows users who are now aware that their machines have been running surveillance and data collection systems they didn't fully understand are in a specific position. They know something is wrong. They have read about the nightly transmissions. They have read about the behave IORL tracking. They have read about the file monitoring and the AI activity systems, and the telemetry rollback mechanism that progressively undoes the privacy settings uses. Gears try to configure. They understand that their operating system is doing things that don't serve them, and they are facing the practical reality that fixing it through Windows 11's own settings interface is a process involving dozens of separate settings across multiple menus in multiple sections of Windows, settings whose interconnections are not clearly documented, whose completeness cannot be easily verified, and whose stability, after the next update, is not guaranteed given Microsoft's demonstrated willingness to restore default collection through update infrastructure. That is exactly the problem that O&O Shutup 10++ was built to solve, and it solves it more completely, more reliably, and with more ongoing protection than manual settings configuration through Windows' own interface can deliver. Here is exactly what the tool does. Here is exactly what it addresses that Windows' own privacy settings cannot reach. Here is the evidence for why IT is trusted by the privacy research community that has done more to expose Microsoft's data collection practices than any corporate disclosure has ever revealed. Here is what the specific protection it provides under EANS for your files specifically, which is the dimension of Windows 11's surveillance architecture that most directly affects the personal data you have stored on a machine you believe to be private. Here is why the German origin of the tool matters in the context of the Global governmental response to Windows 11's privacy practices. And here is precisely how to download it, run it, and apply it correctly to get maximum protection right now. The starting point for understanding why this tool matters is understanding the gap between what Windows 11's own privacy settings interface offers and what comprehensive privacy protection on a Windows 11 machine actually requires. Microsoft has built privacy settings into Windows 11. They exist. They are real controls that affect real behaviors. The problem is not that they are fake. The problem is what they don't address, what they don't expose clearly, and what happens to them when Windows updates. The settings that Windows 11's own privacy and security section exposes to users cover a fraction of the behavioral data collection and file monitoring infrastructure that Windows 11 actually operates. THE Privacy Settings Interface was built to provide the appearance of user control over privacy in a way that satisfies minimum regulatory compliance requirements, while leaving the deeper and more commercially valuable data collection systems operating outside what the interface exposes. This is not a paranoid interpretation of why the settings are designed as they are. It is the straightforward explanation for a design pattern that consistently places the most impactful privacy controls outside the visible settings interface while placing less impactful controls prominently within it. The scheduled tasks that run data compilation and transmission operations are not accessible through the Privacy and Security Settings menu. The Windows services that maintain behavioral monitoring infrastructure are not adjustable through the Privacy Settings controls. The registry entries that configure telemetry collection scope are not editable through the settings interface. The network-level behaviors that transmit compiled data through channels designed to resist network-level blocking are not addressed by anything in the Privacy and Security section. The group policy settings that can enforce privacy restrictions at a level more durable than user settings are not accessible to Windows 11 home users through any built-in interface. The rollback mechanism that progressively restores default colic tie-in settings when comprehensive privacy hardening has been applied is not something any Windows settings menu discloses or provides controls for. O&O Shutup 10++ addresses all of these dimensions through a single interface that makes the full scope of Windows 11's privacy adjustments visible, explains what each adjustment does in PL AON language, and applies changes across all the system layers that comprehensive protection requires simultaneously, rather than requiring users to navigate separately to Task Scheduler, Services, Registry Editor, and Group Policy Editor in sequence. Here's the number that makes this concrete. Independent Power Analysis identified the AI background processing category as responsible for between 8 and 14% of total system power draw on affected machines during typical productivity sessions involving document editing, browser use, and email. 8 to 14% of total system power, continuously, for features that most users in the testing sample had never actively used. To address this, navigate to Windows settings using the Windows key and I. Select Personalization, then find the section for AI and Copilot features. Disable background activity for Copilot. Turn off AI-enhanced search indexing. In Privacy and Security, find AI-related settings and disable the options that reference improving AI models through your usage. Then navigate to Apps, find any Copilot-related applications listed, select advanced options for each, and set their background activity permissions to Never. This tells Windows these applications cannot consume resources when you haven't explicitly opened them. Additionally, open Task Manager using Control, Shift, and Escape together. Click the Startup Apps tab. Identify any AI or Copilot-related entries in the STA RTUP list and disable them. These entries launch components into background memory at system startup and maintain them throughout your session. Preventing them from launching at startup eliminates their continuous background power draw entirely rather than simply reducing it. The battery impact of this change alone, documented across testing on multiple device categories, averages 9% improvement in battery life during typical productivity workloads. On an 8-hour baseline battery, that is 43 additional minutes per charge cycle every single day, that you are currently surrendering to Microsoft's AI background infrastructure. Setting 2, the telemetry and data collection processing load. The second category is connected to something discussed in earlier contexts, but not fully examined from a battery consumption angle, which is where the hidden cost becomes most visible for everyday users, who thought the primary consequence of Windows telemetry was privacy, not performance. Windows 11's telemetry and data collection systems do not simply sit passively waiting to transmit data at SC scheduled intervals. They process data continuously. The system monitoring components, the BEH behavioral activity logging, the application usage tracking, and the advertising identifier update processes all require a computational work to function. They sample system state, analyze patterns, package data for transmission, and maintain active connections to Microsoft's data infrastructure. All of that computational work consumes power. The intensity of this processing was quantified in the same independent power analysis that identified the AI processing load. The telemetry and DATA collection category was identified as consuming between 5 and 9% of total system power draw on affected machines during typical use sessions. This figure is lower than the AI processing category individually, but compounds with it. 5 to 9% continuous power consumption for data collection that benefit Microsoft's analytics and advertising infrastructure represents a real measurable tax on your battery life that you're paying without knowing it for services that benefit Microsoft, not you. The data collection processing load is also not uniform across the day. It spikes during periods of high user activity, which is precisely when the behavioral data being collected is most valuable to Microsoft's systems. You're on an important call, generating rich behavioral data about your application usage patterns, your typing activity, your communication patterns. The telemetry processing spike picks exactly that moment, the moment when you most need consistent performance and battery life, to draw additional power from Microsoft's data infrastructure. Power monitoring tests documented telemetry processing spikes of up to 23% above baseline during active multitasking sessions. The most demanding battery periods of your typical workday, when you're doing the most and need the most from your machine, are also the periods when Windows is working hardest in the background collecting data about what you're doing. Addressing this requires working at multiple levels. In Windows settings, go to Privacy and Security, then Diagnostics and Feedback. Set diagnostic data to the minimum option, which is send required diagnostic data only. Turn off improve inking and typing. Turn off tailored experiences. Each of these settings reduces the scope and therefore the processing intensity of what Windows is collecting and analyzing. Next, address the service level. Open the Run dialog with Windows key and R, type services.msc and press Enter. Find Connected User Experiences and Telemetry. Right-click, select Properties, change the startup type to Disabled, and click Stop to halt it immediately. Find sysmain, which is also called superfetch, and evaluate whether it should be disabled. On SSDs, sysmain provides limited benefit and consumes power maintaining its predictive file loading cache. On SSD-equipped laptops, disabling sysmain produces measurable battery improvement without meaningful performance cost. Find the Diagnostic Policy Service and the Diagnostic Service Host in the Services list. Set both to manual rather than automatic. Manual start means they only run when something specifically triggers them rather than maintaining permanent active states throughout your computing session. For users with Windows 11 Pro or Enterprise, Group Policy adds another layer of control. Through gpedit.msc, navigate to Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Data Collection, and Preview Builds. Set Allow Diagnostic Data to Disabled. This policy level control is more durable against update resets than user settings level changes. The documented battery improvement from addressing telemetry processing specifically averages 7% Ager-Oss, the testing sample. Combined with the AI processing changes above where we're now recovering an average of 16% battery life, well over an hour on a standard 8-hour baseline device. Setting 3. The background app. Refresh and live synchronization infrastructure. The third category is the one that surprises people most when they see the power consumption numbers, because its components individually seem harmless and even useful. The problem is, M is not any single component. The problem is, what Windows 11 has made the default behavior across all of them simultaneously, creating a continuous, synchronized refresh infrastructure that maintains constant network activity, constant processing load, and therefore constant battery drain across your entire session. Windows 11's default configuration enables background refresh and synchronization for a very large number of applications and system components simultaneously. The Windows widgets panel refreshes live news, weather, stock information, and Microsoft's curated content feed continuously in the background. OneDrive synchronization monitors file changes and maintains ongoing cloud synchronization activity. Microsoft Teams background presence monitoring keeps your availability status updated. The mail and calendar applications refresh in the background on intervals. The Microsoft Store checks for application updates continuously. The Xbox gaming infrastructure maintains background connections even when you're not gaming. Windows N, EWS interest tracking collects and processes content relevance data continuously. Search indexing performs ongoing background indexing activity. And a Windows Update checking maintains periodic network communication checking for available updates. Each of these individually sounds like a reasonable background service. Some of them represent genuinely useful functionality that users would choose to keep with full knowledge of the battery cost. The problem is that Windows 11 enables all of them simultaneously by default without showing you a clear summary of the aggregate power cost of that combination. The power analysis of this category found something that should be presented to every Windows 11 user when they first set up their machine. The combined background refresh and synchronization infrastructure running at Windows 11's default settings was responsible for between 11 and 17% of total system power draw during typical productivity sessions. Between 11 and 17% of your battery continuously for background services maintaining live updates. You may be glancing at occasionally, if at all. The widgets panel specifically drew attention in the analysis. Microsoft's Windows 11 widgets, which surface news, weather, and content recommendations, powered by Microsoft's news and advertising ecosystem, maintain continuous background processes. These processes are not only downloading and refreshing content, they are running the same kind of behavioral analytics associated with Microsoft's advertising personalization infrastructure, collecting data about which widgets you engage with and using it to refine content targeting. Your battery is funding a continuous content relevance analysis system that serves Microsoft's advertising business, running in the background of your computer all day, whether you have the widgets panel open or not. The widgets panel background power draw was isolated in testing as responsible for approximately 4% of total system power drain on its own. 4%, continuously. For a panel that most users open for perhaps 30 seconds at a time occasionally. The month when accumulated reasons became concrete decisions is specific and recent and worth understanding precisely because it reveals something important about how Microsoft's relationship with its gaming user base has deteriorated past the point where goodwill and inertia are sufficient to hold it. Here is exactly what happened this month that triggered the decision wave. Here's exactly what those decisions are replacing. Windows 11 with and W high, that alternative is ready in a way it has never been before. Here's what the performance data shows when the same hardware runs Windows 11 versus the alternative. Here is what Microsoft's internal response to the gaming exodus looks like and why it is not working. Here is what Bill Gates' reported reaction to watching the gaming audience abandon the platform he built reveals about how seriously the people closest to Microsoft's legacy understand what this moment represents. And here is what every gamer still on Windows 11 needs to understand about what their machine is doing to their gaming performance right now, that they can verify themselves in 10 minutes. The trigger this month was not a single event, but a convergence of 3 developments that arrived in the same window and whose combined impact on gaming communities exceeded what any one of them would have produced individually. The first was the gaming community's discovery and rapid spread of the performance analysis that quantified exactly what Windows 11's background processes cost in gaming-specific terms. Prior coverage of Windows 11's background overhead had described it in general computing terms: battery drain percentages, CPU utilization figures, background memory consumption. Gaming communities received this information with moderate interest, but without the visceral personal impetuses. When performance analysts began publishing gaming-focused measurements, frame timing consistency comparisons, input latency measurements, CPU availability for game threads during active gaming sessions, with and without Windows 11's AI background infrastructure active, the numbers landed in gaming communities with an immediacy that general computing coverage had not achieved. The specific numbers that spread fastest were the frame timing consistency measurements. Average frame rate, the metric that gaming coverage has historically focused on, showed modest differences between Windows 11 default configuration and privacy-hardened configuration. Frame timing variance, which measures how consistently the system delivers frames rather than how many it delivers on average, showed differences that experienced gamers immediately recognized as significant. The stuttering, the momentary hitches, the brief input response inconsistencies that competitive gamers had been experiencing and attributing to game-side issues or networking. K-variants were documented in timing analysis as correlating directly with Windows 11's background AI processing spikes. The spikes were happening during gaming sessions. The timing variance was the experiential result of those spikes. The numbers made the connection undeniable. Gaming community processed performance data differently from general computing communities. The marginal frame timing improvement that a general computer user might accept as interesting but not personally important is information that a competitive gamer experiences as the difference between a reaction time advantage and a reaction time disadvantage, between a game feeling smooth and a game feeling like it is working against you, between your hardware delivering what you paid for and your hardware being throttled by a background process serving Microsoft's data collection objectives rather than your gaming session. When the numbers connected Windows 11's background surveillance infrastructure to measurable competitive gaming performance degradation, the reaction was not academic. It was personal and immediate. The second development was the completion of the Steam Deck's cultural normalization cycle and its specific impact on how gaming communities now discuss platform alternatives. Valve's Steam Deck has been available long enough that a substantial and vocal portion of the gaming community has lived experience using a Linux-based gaming environment for their portable gaming. Steam Deck owners who have been using SteamOS for months or years arrived at the Windows 11 performance conversation with a reference point that prior Linux gaming discussions had always lacked. They were not theorizing about what Linux gaming would feel like. They were describing what it actually felt like from personal daily experience, and their descriptions matched the performance data in ways that gave the theoretical numbers personal testimonial weight. The Steam Deck owner testimony that spread through gaming co-pattern that made it unusually persuasive. It did not make claims about Linux gaming being perfect or about SteamOS being superior to Windows in every dimension. It made specific, honest, experience-based claims about the smoothness of the gaming experience, the absence of update interruption anxiety during gaming sessions, the speed of boot into your laptop battery is lying to you, not in the way batteries normally degrade over time, not the gradual, expected decline that comes from charge cycles accumulating across months and years of normal use. Something more specific than that, something more deliberate, something that is happening right now, today, on your machine, because of decisions Microsoft made inside Windows 11 that you were never clearly told about and almost certainly never agreed to. Your battery is draining faster than it should. Your laptop is running hotter than it used to. You're reaching for your charger earlier in the day than you did 6 months ago on the same machine. You've probably noticed this and attributed it to battery aging, to having more applications open, to some vague sense that computers just slow down over time, and that's simply what happens. That explanation is convenient for Microsoft. It's not accurate. What's actually happening is that Windows 11 is running 3 categories of background processes that are consuming your battery at rates that would alarm you if they were visible. Processes that weren't running at this intensity on your machine 2 years ago. Processes that Microsoft activated or significantly expanded through update cycles without sending you a notification, explaining what OS changing, or asking whether you wanted your battery being consumed this way. Processes tied directly to Microsoft's AI ambitions, data collection infrastructure, and advertising personalization systems, all of which benefit Microsoft's strategic objectives, and none of which benefit your battery life or your productivity. The researchers who discovered the full scope of this found numbers that are not subtle, not marginal inefficiencies that add up to an extra 15 minutes off away our battery life. Measurable, significant documented battery drain attributed directly to identifiable Windows background processes that have no legitimate reason to be running at their current intensity on the average user's machine. Here is exactly what those 3 settings categories are. Here is exactly what they're doing to your batter why. Here is exactly why Microsoft enabled them the way they did. Here's the evidence that this is systemic and intentional rather than accidental. And here is the precise process for disabling all 3 right now, before your next meeting runs out of power 40 minutes before you expected it to. How this was discovered and why it matters. Before getting into the 3 specific problem areas, you need to understand how this story surfaced, because the way it was found tells you something important about how deeply buried these settings are, and why the average user would never discover them independently. Battery life testing is a standard part of professional laptop and operating system reviews. Technology publications benchmark battery performance under controlled conditions. They run SDA, standardized workloads on devices, and measure how long the battery lasts under consistent usage patterns. They've been doing this for years, which means they have historical baseline data that makes deviations from expected performance visible. What reviewers and researchers began noticing in recent Windows 11 update cycles was a pattern that didn't fit the normal explanations. Devices that had established battery life baselines were showing performance degradation that exceeded what battery aging alone would account for. The degradation was correlated with specific Windows Update deployments, not distributed evenly over time. Machines that received certain updates showed battery life drops. Machines that hadn't received those updates maintained closer to their established baselines. That correlation triggered deeper investigation. Power monitoring tools that measure per-process energy consumption were used to audit what Windows 11 was actually running in TH background and how much power each component was drawing. The results produced a picture that privacy researchers, consumer advocates, and battery optimization specialists have since described as one of the most significant hidden performance cost stories in Windows' recent history. 3 specific categories of Windows background processes were identified as primary contributors to unexplained battery drain. All 3 are connected to Microsoft's broader strategic priorities around AI, data collection, and personalized advertising. All 3 were expanded or newly activated through update infrastructure without prominent user notification. All 3 can be disabled or significantly reduced without affecting the core functionality that most users actually need from their computers. The magnitude of the impact when all 3 are addressed varies by machine configuration, USAGE pattern, and hardware specification. But independent testing across multiple device categories documented battery life improvements ranging from 18% to 31% after applying the full set of changes described in this piece. On a laptop with an 8-hour baseline battery life, 18% represents over an hour and 20 minutes of additional runtime. 31% represents nearly 2.5 additional hours. These are not marginal quality of life improvements. These are the difference between making it through a full workday without a charger and not making it. And Microsoft is the reason you're losing them. Setting 1, the AI processing background engine. The first and most significant source of hidden battery drain is the category of processes that Microsoft has deployed to support Windows 11's AI features. Understanding why these processes are so battery intensive requires understanding what they're actually doing. Microsoft's AI integration in Windows 11, encompassing Copilot, Recall, AI-enhanced search, and the AI components of various system utilities, requires continuous background processing. The AI systems need to be ready to respond instantly when called, which means they cannot simply start from zero when you open them. They maintain active states in the BACK ground, consuming computational resources and therefore battery power, to achieve the low latency responsiveness that Microsoft's AI feature demos showcase. On devices with dedicated neural processing units, the NPU chips that newer Intel, AMD, and Qualcomm processors include specifically for AI workloads, some of this processing can be handled at relatively low power cost. But Windows 11 does not limit AI background processing to NPU-capable hardware. On machines without dedicated neural processing units, which represents a substantial portion of the Windows 11 installed base, AI background processing falls to the main CPU and in some cases the GPU. Both draw significantly more power for AI workloads than a dedicated NPU would. The power monitoring analysis documented specific processes within this category. The Windows AI Infrastructure Service, various Copilot integration background processes, the AI indexing components associated with Windows search enhancements, and the background processing infrastructure for Recall's screenshot analysis on Copilot plus PCs were all identified as drawing power consistently throughout normal laptop use sessions, not just when AI features were actively in use. The term consistently is the critical one. These processes don't activate when you open Copilot and deactivate when you close it. They maintain active states throughout your computing session in anticipation of being needed. The power draw is continuous. Your laptop battery is lying to you, not in the way batteries normally degrade over time, not the gradual expected decline that comes from charge cycles accumulating across months and years of normal use. Something more specific than that, something more deliberate, something that is happening right now, today, on your machine, because of decisions Microsoft made inside Windows 11 that you were never clearly told about and almost certainly never agreed to. Your battery is draining faster than it should. Your laptop is running hotter than it used to. You're reaching for your charger earlier in the day than you did 6 months ago on the same machine. You've probably noticed this and attributed it to battery aging, to having more applications open, to some vague sense that computers just slow down over time, and that's simply what happens. That explanation is convenient for Microsoft. It's not accurate. What's actually happening is that Windows 11 is running 3 categories of background processes that are consuming your battery at rates that would alarm you if they were visible. Processes that weren't running at this intensity on your machine 2 years ago. Processes that Microsoft activated or significantly expanded through update cycles without sending you a notification, explaining what OS changing, or asking whether you wanted your battery being consumed this way. Processes tied directly to Microsoft's AI ambitions, data collection infrastructure, and advertising personalization systems, all of which benefit Microsoft's strategic objectives, and none of which benefit your battery life or your productivity. The researchers who discovered the full scope of this found numbers that are not subtle, not marginal inefficiencies that add up to an extra 15 minutes off away our battery life. Measurable, significant documented battery drain attributed directly to identifiable Windows background processes that have no legitimate reason to be running at their current intensity on the average user's machine. Here is exactly what those 3 settings categories are. Here is exactly what they're doing to your batter why. Here is exactly why Microsoft enabled them the way they did. Here's the evidence that this is systemic and intentional rather than accidental. And here is the precise process for disabling all 3 right now, before your next meeting runs out of power 40 minutes before you expected it to. How this was discovered and why it matters. Before getting into the 3 specific problem areas, you need to understand how this story surfaced, because the way it was found tells you something important about how deeply buried these settings are, and why the average user would never discover them independently. Battery life testing is a standard part of professional laptop and operating system reviews. Technology publications benchmark battery performance under controlled conditions. They run SDA, standardized workloads on devices, and measure how long the battery lasts under consistent usage patterns. They've been doing this for years, which means they have historical baseline data that makes deviations from expected performance visible. What reviewers and researchers began noticing in recent Windows 11 update cycles was a pattern that didn't fit the normal explanations. Devices that had established battery life baselines were showing performance degradation that exceeded what battery aging alone would account for. The degradation was correlated with specific Windows update deployments, not distributed evenly over time. Machines that received certain updates showed battery life drops. Machines that hadn't received those updates maintained closer to their established baselines. That correlation triggered deeper investigation. Power monitoring tools that measure per process energy consumption were used to audit what Windows 11 was actually running in TH background and how much power each component was drawing. The results produced a picture that privacy researchers, consumer advocates, and battery optimization specialists have since described as one of the most significant hidden performance cost stories in Windows' recent history. 3 specific categories of Windows background processes were identified as primary contributors to unexplained battery drain. All 3 are connected to Microsoft's broader strategic priorities around AI, data collection, and personalized advertising. All 3 were expanded or newly activated through update infrastructure without prominent use.